Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining us for this month's Coffee Talk. My name is Sean O'Brien, and as always, I am pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Friday morning. My name is Steve Huntington. I'm the Director of Analytics here at QwickRate and QwickAnalytics. Spent my entire career working with community financial institutions on everything from M&A and strategic planning and valuation to model design and maintenance. And I've been working with Sean here at QwickRate for a little over a decade now, I guess.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Thanks everybody again for joining. Hopefully most of us are taking, some type of exhale that we got through the first quarter filing of the call report. Congratulations. I think as we've discussed on this session and months prior, our expectation is that, hey, we wanted to get through implementation. And now the rest of the year, I think we'll start to find some comfort in the tool and the process. We'll probably start to potentially dig a little bit deeper. And I think, what we hope to accomplish and continue to do is be responsive to not only, enhancing the tool from suggestions that you make, from what the industry is saying, but, just kind of, keep pace with the evolution that I think we'll see with CECL. So, we're going to do some polling questions again today. One of them is about just change itself and changes to the tool. But, again, I think, we feel like these sessions have been helpful and we're going to continue to offer them. And, again, try to be sensitive to just, again, staying close to the tool and what your needs are and trying to improve those as we move forward. Again, the chat and the Q&A are the easiest ways to submit questions. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about some of the enhancements that have been made. We've touched on these in previous sessions, but since a little bit of the urgency is off with the first quarter, we just thought we would take a little bit more time and make sure everybody's aware of a lot of the changes we've made. We know they came a little bit in a flurry here towards the end. And so again, just want to be sensitive to make sure everybody's aware of enhancements that we believe are improving the tool. All right. So again, we always kind of know why we're here, but I'm going to start off with some polling questions, just a few this time. But the first one was, increasingly we're being asked if you've been through an auditor exam. So we're, going to continually be curious to see what type of response we get here. I know personally for our bank in Illinois, we just concluded our OCC exam. They looked at our, CECL solution, obviously using CECLSolver. Everything was okay, but they did indicate that they are this first go around, taking a peek at what every bank is doing, and they'll probably discuss it at our next exam again. But we're happy with the way the tool was working, what we were doing, and felt like we were well on the way to addressing this. So that was very good news from us personally. Okay, so this one, 84% of you have not had yet an exam or an audit. 16% yes. So thank you for that one. Let me move to the next question. Again, this is one we've asked before, but I'm going to probably keep asking it. Do you anticipate further increase in your reserve over the course of 2023? So I think, obviously the environment is, in many cases, has still been good, but it's certainly uncertain. So I think I'm curious just to try to keep our pulse on how everybody's feeling about the outlook for 2023. So we'll give this just a 15 or more seconds. Okay. All right. So pretty evenly split. So 51% said yes, 49% said no. So that's interesting. And thank you again for sharing that. Let's go to the next question. in terms of CECL, our tool itself, again, we are trying to make changes, but we want to make sure we're not doing them too quickly or too slowly. So we're just kind of curious if you think the changes and the enhancements that we're making, you'd like to see them more frequently, less frequently, or at the current pace of change. Again, we know everyone wants to get to a comfort level, and we appreciate that as much as anybody. But I think, again, as we talk to you and we do get good suggestions, we do want to be sensitive to trying to continually improve CECLSolver as we move forward here. So, okay, so this one, I'm going to go ahead and share. 9% more frequently, 10% less frequently, 80% at the current pace. So again, we're gonna, as we've discussed before, be sensitive, try to make sure we're giving you plenty of notice if when updates are coming. But I do think, as Steve and I talk and we talk to the IT team, I think we've got a pretty long laundry list of things that we are considering and in this different stages of development. So I think it's pretty safe to say you'll continue to see, hopefully, and agree that with the improvements we make with the tool. Okay. So I think those are the three questions. We just have one more then. And this one you can just type into the maybe the chat feature is, we are curious if there's one thing in particular that you'd like to see us improve about CECLSolver, the product or the service. We want to make sure we're giving you the opportunity to be specific about things you'd like to see us improve or share. So probably the easiest way is to put those in the chat, but we'll have a record of those, and then we can see those and take those into account and review after our call today. So we'll kind of move on there, but throughout the presentation this morning, if you want to go ahead and submit anything, please do. Steve and I talked quite a bit about this week about trying to get feedback from you, and we felt like this was probably the best opportunity to do it rather than a follow-up survey or some form like that. So okay, so thanks again for answering the polling questions. Thanks for submitting anything you want us to see, try to improve with CECL. And now on to some of the updates and the enhancements that, again, we've made. And we're going to have Steve touch on these, but, again, we've made improvements to the warm estimator tool. We really have done a lot with the bank data set, allowing you to export it into Excel, the policy templates. So again, there's been a large number of improvements, which again, I'm not going to, you can see on the screen, but some of those that really more are in your, just kind of in the rhythm of preparing CECL. I wanted Steve just to kind of take everybody through again today. So Steve, at this point, I'm going to turn it to you.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about a couple of the more recent enhancements and work our way through it. One as an example, I think I'll share those online, but we'll stay on this slide for just a second. So the first one was, after we had made some updates to the tool to more closely match what we're dealing with from an accounting standpoint, right? As opposed to calculating a kind of one overarching CECL impact value, focusing on the specific adjustments we need to make to our balance sheet to make them CECL compliant, dealing with the securities portfolio, the unfunded commitments, and the loan portfolio as three separate entities, because that's what the reporting requires. We got a lot of feedback saying that people would like to see kind of a summary page added, just a short and sweet summary showing some of the most important metrics from your current scenario, comparing it to your last month or your last quarter, and then seeing a couple visuals. So we added a summary page there, and I'll show everyone that in just a minute. And then secondly, we had gotten requests over the years for years. I know we've been living with CECL for longer than some of my kids have been alive, for additional flexibility in the look back periods. We made an initial decision early on in development to keep things as simple as possible, that we would marry or kind of link the look back periods, or at least the length of the look back periods, to the warms. This makes the math simpler. It's just a little bit easier to conceptualize at a time when everyone was trying to conceptualize CECL, not just you guys, but also your examiners and auditors as well. But there are certain situations if you have a very, very short warm, but you want to take into account a longer historical period. If you are, I know they're like unicorns these days, but there are de novos out there that do not have very much loan loss history of their own. And there's also a lot of users of ours who are savings and loans or old OTS filing thrifts who filed the thrift financial reports up until about 10 years ago, meaning that we didn't have call report data for them. And they wanted longer look back periods than we had data for. So there was circumstances where we wanted to allow users to choose, let's say gather 13 years worth of historical data, even if you only have a warm of 2.5 years on a particular segment. It would involve additional math, so we had to do it carefully, but we wanted to add that. And that's what this second enhancement's all about. And I'm gonna walk you guys through it here on the screen interactively in a second. I think it's hard to visualize, but it's easy to understand once we start looking at it. Sean, you want to flip to the next slide, and then I'll go ahead and share my screen here.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, to what Steve said, right? I mean, I think one of the things going back to the same warm period and look back period was, again, in the idea of, trying to forecast for most banks and for everybody, that's difficult. And the idea was by mirroring and being symmetrical about that warm and the look back, it did provide the foundation, for that, forward-looking analysis. But I think, as Steve pointed out, for any number of reasons, whether it's been a benign, recent, past experience, a de novo, many of you wanted to potentially look at a longer period of time, but then still have it come down into a warm value. And so this is what, we really think we've addressed. And so anyway, Steve, take it away.
Yeah, because there's so many, one thing that's not all community banks for sure, but large swaths of community banks around the country have had extremely healthy asset quality over an extended period of time. And so even under the old methodology, the vast majority of your reserve was Q factors, right? You just didn't have very much loss history to justify the reserve levels we were all keeping. And so it was pretty much justifying it through Q factors. And conceptually, that's really been not that different under CECL. And so the burden for, having an examiner and an auditor be comfortable with your reserve level was 90 some odd % on just justification of Q factors. And some institutions were looking to shift some of that explanatory burden towards historical data. So if they could capture more of, let's say, the last credit crisis, right, the last downturn, so that they'd have more in their loss history, even if it was looking over a longer period, and then have a little less burden on Q factors making up the entire reserve, it allows you to shift that with a little bit more flexibility, if that makes sense, Sean. But everyone can see my screen here. Let's take a step back and just look at the summary tool again. This is our guinea pig for today is a large, pretty large community bank up in the Northeast. And if we pull up the summary tool, what we see is these were their values that they reported on their call report as of 12/31, 36 million in reserve and on a $4 billion balance, so just under 1% loan loss reserve. And under their current scenario, so this is, you notice these data points here are overridable, which means that if you wanted to track it on a month-to-month basis, you wouldn't be stuck with just your your previous quarter call report. You can say, hey, I'm going to plug in my data from, February 28th, because I'm just tracking. I want to see what happened in March. And this is something that I am tracking, calculating monthly. I could come in here, type in 2/28/23. So the date here is a reference for you so that you remember what date this data is as of, if you were to override it or change it. And then you could type in your balances, your values as of, let's say, the end of February. And then you could compare on a month-to-month basis. But by default, this data here is coming from the last call report. And this data here on the left, which is not overridable because it's an output from your tool. So if you were looking for just summary values coming from your scenario, this is it. Whatever you calculate on the tool as your ACL populates into the summary tab here. Whatever your total balance is that you have on your loan portfolio, whether it is last quarters, or whether you overrode these values to be, let's say, yesterday's or the end of last month's, non-public, non-call report data, they would transfer right over to here. So this kind of shows your current values for your current scenario and then previous quarter. We also have a couple visuals down here, which people have been asking for, which I think can be very helpful. These just show some annual reserve level trends, and this shows some last 6 quarters. So we can see here what this particular bank, what happened with them over the last couple of quarters reserve wise, and then comparing it to the peer group. So if I were to change the peer group here to, let's say, a UBPR peer group or a state-based community bank peer group or any custom peer group you use, you would see these peer lines change magically before your eyes. So that's the new summary tab. And again, if you think this kind of loan portfolio summary captures the vast majority of what you need and it's not overly busy, you don't have to use or export the summary tab at all. Just like everything else that we do enhancement wise, you certainly don't have to print off, PDF, export, whatever, this new summary tab. You can start just with a loan portfolio summary, which is the way we always had it before. Just wanted to add a little bit of a different new way to visualize summary high level data from the tool.
Yeah, and I think the other point was, Steve, I can jump in here real quick again.
Sure.
Prior to 2023, with the way we had everything on the loan portfolio summary page, right or wrong, we did that because we wanted to show the potential cumulative impact of what CECL might present for banks. But now that we're in the actual implementation and there are those 3 specific reserves, we felt this was changing or not changing on a period to period basis. So,
yep. You'll notice down here a couple new buttons. These were things that we thought could be helpful in your reserve analysis, and they take you to some other places within QwickAnalytics. So right outside of a CECL tool, but within our analytics platform. The one I wanted to briefly show was what we call industry research. I'm going to hold down the control button so I don't lose this page and click on industry research. And open up a new tab here. And what the industry research does is, a lot of you probably are familiar with this as a different part of the QwickAnalytics package, but for those of you who aren't, this is a great, very visual tool to look at trends in the industry, to look at trends between individual competitors over whatever time periods you want to look at, and either comparing mostly credit, but we also have some performance metrics in here as well. Let's say, we were looking at our mortgage portfolio and we wanted to kind of go upstream and see what our 30 to 89 days past due were. So kind of see when when a problem first hits the call report, what that trend looks like. And let's say we'll just do % of loans, and we will add a bank here, and I'll research them. And so this is their 30 to 89 days past due for their mortgage portfolio for the first liens over the last 12 quarters. If we want, we can do it over the last 12 years, or we can toggle back to quarters here. And if I want to add other individual banks, I could do that. I could add a second bank here. I can add any sort of peer group, whether it's, I want all the community banks in the state of California. I'll add them. There they are. I also would like just my UBPR peer group. There again, this is a bigger, they're in peer group 3. So I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to say I also want UBPR peer group 3, and I'll make them purple. Why not? So you can add different peer groups, add different individual banks, and see any of those credit related trends that you'd like, or some performance based ones as well. And you can overlay economic trends on top of it. Let's say I want California's unemployment rate. We'll make that red, probably appropriate. There you go. So we can track these over different periods of time. If you want to see the data, obviously this is very visual, but it doesn't give you the data points. This gives you all the data points, and you can pull it directly as a PDF to easily kind of snapshot and attach it to another report or export it to Excel. The reason I wanted to show this, and we put this button right on the summary page for CECL, is not just for looking at these loss trends, but also so you could start tracking what's going on with reserve trends, right, for other community banks. So I'm going to reset the chart, clear everything out, and I'm going to add reserves to loans. And I'm just going to add, let's say, California community banks. And I'm going to add just the UBPR peer group real quick. Always like sticking them in there, and that guy and that. So right here we see, we were all expecting somewhat of a bump in reserve levels once the majority of us had adopted CECL, and we saw a bump, but it was nothing like some of the fear mongering that we heard of a couple years ago, at least not for the typical community banks. Larger banks had a bit of a larger bump in CECL, but it was in reserve due to CECL, but it was spread out a little bit over time because there were a lot of large institutions that had to adopt earlier. So you saw kind of a slower drive up, at least. Community banks have seen a slight increase, but not that much. We'll see that a little bit more later when we talk some more about the recent trends, but thought this was a good place to kind of just show you what this tool looks like, and you can access it through any of the the header links up here, or directly from the CECL page. Sorry, from the summary page on the CECLSolver. It's just called Industry Research. Sean, any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's great, but let's pause for a second before we go into the historical, because we do have some questions. So I want to get to them before we get too far away. So the first one, let me make sure I get all these up. So this is probably as much a comment as anything, Steve, but it's in the CECL look-back period. You can change the length of the look-back period. However, if you're comfortable with the look-back period, but have one or two loans in a category that no longer are considered part of the current pool, is there a way to make an adjustment to the charge-off amounts? So this gets back to, it's twofold, right? You can make changes to the balances, but right now we don't have an easy way to change.
If we're talking about the historical data, right? You can, we have, as we talked about, lots of more straightforward tools now for making adjustments to the current loan balances, to exclude, anything we want from a pool. You can do it through the manual exclusions and adjustments, and also through the individually assessed. If we're talking about, and I think more of these questions now are more geared towards the entirety of the historical experience, right? And can we go in and modify our actual long-term, quarterly, going back 15 years, comprehensive historical balance or loss history on a segment by segment basis? That is something we have not addressed because of the additional complexity that it would add to the tool. Creating that ability in this interactive environment would be very challenging, because it would mean we'd have to take 15 years worth of quarterly data at the segment level for charge-offs, recoveries, balances, and everything else, and make every single one of those fields manually overridable, which would mean they'd all have to be individually saved. We wouldn't be able to track changes, and when things diverge from the call reports, it'd be very difficult to tie it all back, and it would just become a bit of a monster to manage in this interactive environment. So that being said, before that being said, so that's why, as of now, you don't have the ability to go into the historical analysis and just start modifying all your historical balances to exclude things, whether it's a loan held for sale, or whether it's a loan that got reclassified, or there was an individual loan that was charged off that was an error, or anything like that diverges from the actual published public call report data. Now I get to the that being said part. It's something we've been aware of since we started building the tool. As a limitation, I don't want to call it a simplifying assumption, but as a limitation for lots of legitimate reasons. So we are looking at a solution to that, which is would be in a much more flexible environment, which would be Excel, right? An ability to kind of take all that quarterly data, export it into an Excel environment. We already have a tool for exporting the tool or the data into Excel, but it's not a functional environment, right? You can export the data, but then you just have it sitting in an Excel file, and you still have to do all that stuff yourself in order to try to recreate the historical loss rates with the exclusions that you want. So we're working on a solution that would allow you to pull all that data into a usable formulaic Excel environment that you could then go change any balances or losses that were appropriate to do so at the segment level, and then have those historical lifetime loss rates recalculate all in Excel. And then you could take that and use it as an override here in the interactive tool. That was a mouthful, and B, a large promise, which is challenging to deliver from a technical standpoint. but we've had lots of calls for it. We understand the reason for it, certainly. And we are working on being able to provide that as an option for, so I hope some of you are quietly golf clapping as I say that, but that is on the front burner as an enhancement. Yes.
Yeah, and it was actually a couple of in the chats we got for enhancements. So it's definitely front of mind for a lot of you. So we recognize that. Steve and I have been, volleying it back and forth, and we think the best way and the most expedient way to get it delivered is, as he mentioned, through Excel. And so since we've already got the data export, we're going to work towards having that as a future enhancement. So we've heard you, and we're working towards a solution.
And the nice thing is we already have file upload functionality. So if you were to say, hey, we've got a bunch of loans we need to pull out of this bucket, and we need to do it historically too. We don't just want to manually override something and then do the math separately. We'd like part of a tool, so you'd be able to export it to Excel, make those adjustments, save that file, put it into your file upload here as support for you going into, let's say, the historical analysis and overriding the lifetime historical loss rate with a note that says support for why this is different comes from the attached file which resides here.
Yeah, and I think in a parallel path, we, right or wrong, again, had planned on more granular loan level type of analysis like that to be done through our IntelliCredit platform. So, at the same time, Steve's going to be doing this as an alternative through Excel. We are working, and I think we'll, if you really are accelerating down the path to more granular loan level stuff, then we can talk about maybe what IntelliCredit can do for you later on this year. Okay, the next question is, would like to see a question about what the group of banks have for reserve for unfunded commitments. So yeah, that's a good question. Actually, we'll make that a polling question next month. We'll make sure we include that as a polling question and bring that kind of information to you. Are the balances that populate on the summary tab the loan portfolio total before adjustments, cash secured / government guaranteed, or after?
Yeah, I believe it's before, and the reason why, and that's of course it's always up for debate. It's a subjective decision. I believe it is the stated balances before adjustments, and the reason that I did that was because I was trying to keep this as comparable to peer data as possible. And obviously peer data, the peer loss rates, like your ACL as a percentage of your reserve, are not going to have any exclusions built into it because that's not public information. So to make it sort of apples to apples with peer data, I did it on a before adjustment basis. I'm 99% sure. But if we have if the majority of our users, and I can understand why I would want to see that on an adjusted basis, recognizing that it's more accurate for them, but it's going to be a little apples to oranges with the peer data, then we might make that switch and make a note of it. And there was another question on the summary tab here as well.
Yeah, you're gonna take that one by the
custom segments. Yeah. So that was it. It's something that we're currently programming in. We're adding it to the summary tab, but from a programming standpoint, it was more complicated than at first glance to us financial people. Pretty much the programmers have been working with us on it, and it was going to take a little while to get that working properly, and we didn't want to delay the summary tab another 3 weeks or a month just for that functionality. So yes, we plan to add the custom segment stuff for those of you who have custom segments into the summary tab in the near future.
Great. The next question is, if we have a negative loss history rate for a segment, do we still need to make adjustments on the Q factors to bring that to 0? Or is there a way to set the calculation to use 0 as the minimum value for loss history? I'll take that one first, Steve. So we felt and still feel, I would tell you to continue to do it through Q factors. The reason is we want you to see what the actual historical value is, right? If you're in net recovery, we think it's important to note that you are in net recovery. We did not want to override that to 0 because that's not what your historical experience is. So we feel like this is a better way. I'm sure some will disagree with us, but for now, I believe making the adjustment for that net recovery and the Q factors is the right way to do it, just because we do not want to begin to be arbitrary or, kind of subjective about that historical numbers. Those should actually be what your historical numbers are. And I think it's important to know those. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, well, when we improved and enhanced, kind of expanded the Q factors section of the tool, we, at that point, we'd already sort of made the decision, but we wanted to reinforce the decision that we did not want to insert ourselves into your Q factor adjustment process, which means that we don't want to make any, it's not, if it comes in here and it looks and the tool sees that you have a negative historical lifetime loss rate, so it automatically sets a Q factor adjustment equal to the negative amount, so it would be 0. Then it starts confusing you, because you come in here, you see a Q factor page, which is supposed to be all your qualitative factors, and there's something that's automatically plugged in, but then something that's automatically plugged in that has to change and auto modify itself as you start adding your own Q factor adjustments, right? What happened if you're at negative 20 basis points and you make, and so there's an auto adjustment of 20 to make it 0, but then you go in and add a Q factor adjustment across the board for every segment of 10 basis points. Now that auto adjustment has to change again. And then we'll save that scenario. So it's an issue with what the tool does and calculates and recalculates on an automatic basis, and whether that's straightforward and not confusing, and what we want the users to have complete control of, that we're not messing around with by auto recalculating things when new data comes in or you adjust other areas of a tool. So it's a fine line and balance we're always trying to meet there. I think when the Q factor design was more of a blunt instrument that it was when we first designed the tool, we had a Q factor adjustment with no detail. It was kind of easier to set like an automatic recalculate if the historical is negative. But now that there's a lot more flexibility and detail in the Q factor process, it became more problematic to try to do it that way. I know that's probably more detailed of an answer, but.
No, that's good. The next question, and good morning, Mustafa. What are some of the banks within UBPR4 bank group using as their look back period for historical charge-offs for unfunded commitments? So, again, this is something, if somebody wants to, offer anything in the chat, it's something we can certainly delve into in future coffee talks. Just, I think, we can start to, focus in on specific areas of the tool. Again, for unfunded commitments, for many banks, or I shouldn't say that, most banks did not have a process prior to the ACL. So that's why we, suggested a framework. Again, this is an area where I suspect over time we'll get more prescription from auditors and regulators. But right now, the requirement is to simply do an analysis. And so I think the majority of our banks are using our tool as designed. But, certainly as we move forward this year, we can try to delve into more specifically what banks are doing. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think, the tool looks at the historical loss rate for the funded loan portfolio as its initial guidance, right, for the unfunded commitment. So as far as a look back period is concerned, if we're considering historical losses in your unfunded commitments to likely match and mirror your actual losses historically on your funded portfolio, that's the initial kind of universal assumption that the tool makes, right? Is that we assume going forward that unfunded commercial commitments are going to have you'd want to use the same analysis that you'd use to estimate losses on the funded portfolio, because that's where the losses will happen, right? The unfunded commitment is you never have a loss on an unfunded commitment, right? It becomes a loan, it becomes a part of the loan portfolio, and then you would have a loss. So the losses don't act any different than the loan portfolio because they are loan portfolio losses, right? So it's kind of a step removed. The whole concept of creating this ACL and managing it for the unfunded commitments is an entire step removed from reality. It's all one step more hypothetical than your actual experience has ever been. So we just need to keep that in mind a little bit as we, start getting deep in the weeds on unfunded commitments, separate from the rest of how your loan portfolio has performed.
Great. Thanks, Steve. The next question, are regulators requiring CECLSolver model validation from independent model validators, not accepting the quick rate SOC report? Seems to be a lot of firms pitching to validate CECL models. How necessary will this be? So Again, two things around model validation. And I think Paul Allen has touched on this in previous sessions. And, certainly he'll be back in the next month or two. We can bring this up again. But there's really two components to model validation. We provide our SOC 1 as a solution provider. There's a second area where, depending on your regulator, or your auditor or regulator, there's a second validation that potentially can be asked of you, right? Not everyone has to be asked for it. At our small bank in Illinois, we've never been asked to, validate our interest rate risk model, right? It's theoretically a requirement, right? But we haven't been asked to do it. So it's a little bit of regulator arbitrariness. But you could be asked to independently validate the information. That's one of the reasons we've provided the Excel data to do it. We are also, again, this subsequent enhancement to changing the more formulaic Excel tool will allow you to do that as well. So yes, you could be asked to independently validate it, which means you either have to hire somebody to do it or try to do, some independent testing of your own. So this again will be something that I think we'll see more in 2024 because this is a 2023 issue. And so for financial statements, it'll be a part of next year's audit, but certainly people will probably be asked throughout the year to begin doing this. And so we, again, with the enhancement we'll make to the Excel export, we think we can at least, again, do what we can, which is A, provide you with our SOC 1, but then B, give you the tools to independently validate our calculations is what you potentially could be asked to do. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Nope.
Okay. All right, let me just check the chat here. I know we had a lot of requests or suggestions. So maybe Steve, go ahead and continue on with your talk.
Yeah.
And I'll look at these for the next pause.
So that other enhancement we've been alluding to, or I guess starting to discuss and analyze, is on the bottom of the historical. This is where it lives. This is the new columns that we see here. And again, what this allows you to do historically with our tool, if you had a 6-year warm on your mortgage portfolio, right, then we were going to be using a 6-year look back period. You always had the option of changing that 6-year look back period to be a different 6 years of look back, but it was always 6 years, right? That makes the math simple, like everything, like I've already sort of discussed. Now you have the ability to, let's say we want to take into account, they haven't had much losses here. The last time they had any significant losses were 2012, 13, and 14 was when it was a little bit there, no big surprise. In the Northeast, sort of on the tail end of the last credit cycle was when some institutions more on the Northeast side of the country saw some losses. So let's say we want to take into account a longer swath of data going back to the beginning of 2013. I'm going to go to my look back period here, and I'm going to change the look back period to start at the beginning of 2013. Now you see that blue bar, the visual guide of a look back period is now taking into account not 6 years worth of data, but 10 years worth of data from this year all the way back to 2013, and calculating a aggregate loss rate over the entire look back period. This loss rate now is a 10-year aggregate loss rate, right? 10 and a quarter years, I guess. So this is 10 and a quarter years worth of total losses, but we have a warm of 6, right? So this 0.45 is larger than it should be. So what we do is we now have a multiplier, meaning that if we have 10 years of losses or 10 years of look back and a 6-year warm, we take the 10-year loss rate, 10-year aggregate, not average, but aggregate loss rate, and multiply it by 6 over 10 or 0.6. This is 6 and a quarter or 10 and a quarter years, so it's 0.59. So 10 and a quarter years worth of aggregate losses multiplied by 0.59 to make it equivalent to a 6-year aggregate loss rate, 26 basis points. That's the concept. That is as simply as I can put it. Now, there's lots of practical applications for that concept. The most obvious one is this. This is an institution where over the last 7 or 8 years, they've had no losses on their mortgage portfolio. Their mortgage portfolio is half of their loan portfolio. So now they're in the position of justifying a 1% reserve for a portfolio, which is mostly mortgage loans that haven't seen any losses in 7 or 8 years. And so the entire burden of this analysis is on the Q factor adjustments. This is an opportunity or an option where you can say, I think losses from 2013 and 14 are still relevant today and to my potential future losses. And so I want to take that period of time into account. And so now we have a higher loss rate, a higher historical loss rate, and a little bit less burden, if you want to call it that, on the qualitative factors to not have to make up such a high percentage of a total expected future loss rate. And another good example of that is things like construction loans, right? Construction loans and credit card loans have notoriously short average remaining lives. So by default, the tool is only taking into account a very short period of history. So you can come in here and say, we have these guys, they have a portfolio of 1 to 4 family resi construction loans. Last time they saw a loss there was 2011. So unless you have a look back period of 13 years or more, your historical loss rate is going to be 0. So you can say, you know what, I want to get some of those losses in there. I don't care how old they are. Or your examiner might say that. So now I'm pulling in a ton of historical data going all the way back to 2009, capturing some of those losses, even if they're over a decade old, in the construction portfolio. As you can see, it doesn't amount to much of a loss rate in the end calculation, but it's not 0. So more flexibility in choosing historical timeframes that you think are indicative of what you expect moving forward. Yeah, Sean, any additional discussion?
Yeah, I think again, this was just an enhancement, right? You don't have to use the tool, but I think one of the questions we would get often from banks, as Steve articulated, was we've had benign loss history. We want to look and evaluate a much longer period of time. This gives you that ability to do it. So again, you don't have to use it. The tool is perfectly appropriate the way it is, but it does give you an extra level of flexibility to incorporate a much longer look back period if you wish to do that. Now, there are circumstances, one that I actually dealt with just yesterday, where the opposite was the case, where an institution, I was talking to a user and they said, we had a big management change in 2018. The previous management team had some significant problems. They were doing some sketchy stuff, and we had a wholesale change in the management team and underwriting, in 3.5 years ago. So our loss rates prior to that are really not indicative of our current expectation of future losses. So we don't really want to go back more than 3 years on any of our segments. I don't care how long the WARM is, but we got to make sure that we're getting enough loss expectations. So you can say, well, I have a 6-year WARM, but I'm only going to use a 3-year look back period. And then the multiplier will be more than 1, right? You'll be taking 3 years worth of losses and multiplying it by 2 to get a 6-year loss rate. Probably less common for sure, but certainly real world examples that I've dealt with in the last 24 hours as to why older losses may be less relevant or certainly less relevant, but less relevant enough that you wanted to exclude them from the look back period historically. So it's not a one-way street, right? It can be used in either direction. Great. A couple of questions have come in. Is the reserve for unfunded commitments included in Tier 2 capital? The answer to that is yes. The next question is, why wouldn't you have your models certified and charge, if needed, your clients for a copy, rather than having numerous of us have to acquire perform certifications? Again, that's not our distinction. We do provide our certification. We give you a SOC 1. When we discussed with our auditors what we should do, the determination by them was that we should, as a model provider, solution provider, provide a SOC 1. Again, the bank regulations around validation are twofold. One, that what your model or tool provider needs to provide, which we did with the SOC 1, and then independent validation that the bank needs to perform. We can't do anything there for you other than give you our tool. And then again, this is why it's not provide additional data, right? And then provide any additional data that third party might need to help you validate if you need to bring someone else on board or internally. So there's two pieces of it. And so we've tried to make that distinction in the past. We can only do what we can do. So we we give you as part of our agreement, our SOC 1. That's the most we can do. Now we're going to go a step further and give you tools to independently validate it manually. You're welcome to do that, or other people will say they'll have to hire somebody to do it. We have no control over whether your auditor or your regulator is going to ask you to do that. It's in the regs that you're supposed to do that with model validation. But again, there's only so much we can do. We can't do both sides of it, because we're providing what we need to provide, but then there is an additional expectation that the bank will do it independently.
And that's when the earlier question where the question mentioned, I don't know who mentioned the question that a lot of you are getting pitched for model validation services. We are not getting pitched for that, because that has to come from you. That's why they're pitching it to you and not to us, because that's not something that we can provide.
Right. We provide what we can, which is our SOC 1, right? That's what we can provide. So we're trying to do what we can, but we really are, like, there's two pieces of validation that we just can't get around. Okay, so let me see, another question came in. Would users be willing to be part of a user group where we can discuss ideas or questions pertaining to how banks are generally handling situations from management or regulators? We're certainly open to that. I think a lot of ways that's what we think this is. So, I think more specifics on what, people might want or be able to participate in, but that's really one of the reasons we do this, is to provide that forum. If there are specific topics you want us to address, we're happy to do that. Okay, so we had another person said that they do not agree on how we're talking about this independent model validation. Again, we asked our auditors if we should do a model validation or a SOC 1. Model validation, the difference is, in a model, like an interest rate risk model, you make assumptions to generate the tool, right? To generate the output. In our tool, we're not making any assumptions. We are actually reporting back historical numbers with actual calculations. When we asked our auditors they asked us, what are we validating? There's no assumptions being made. They said, what you need is a SOC 1. We provided a SOC 1.
Which pretty much is just, it proves the math works, right? It proves the numbers are accurate from the source, and then the calculations and computations that we put on all that historic data are accurately calculated and presented. The other more robust model validations are models that have future-looking projection assumptions built into, not coming from users, but actually built into the model itself. And ours does not have any of that. It just has historical data and then a set of somewhat advanced computations. And our SOC 1 goes through the entire process of where we get every single piece of data from, validates that they are accurately being collected, accurately being maintained and updated, and then any calculations we do based on that are accurately being performed. And the SOC 1 manages and does all of that.
Yeah, and so we had extensive talks with auditors, and that's what they told us to do. Again, ours is, if we want to be technical about it, ours is really a tool, not a model. So for whatever that's worth. We recently changed from the general WARM calculation to the amortized WARM, given the weight of our residential mortgage portfolio to the total. I'm curious how prevalent the use of amortized WARMs is. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think this is part of why we offered both ways. I'll take this one first. Steve's certainly welcome to answer it as well. When we first designed the tool, my approach and belief is that we wanted to be as conservative as we possibly could. Every bank handles their reserve analysis differently. Some want to be as conservative as possible. Others don't want more than 1 penny more in the reserve than necessary. Our approach was to be conservative. Again, after talking and adding on a number of banks, we had banks, particularly with mortgage portfolios, who just said, hey, we think this is too long of a WARM. We didn't disagree. And so we recognized that we did not take into account in our standard calculation any standard amortization payments that would be occurring. So that's why we came up with the second one. It's not for us to say what your approach to the reserve is. We try to give you the tools to evaluate your reserve however your credit and your team, your culture wants to do it. So there's not a right or wrong answer. It's really however you approach the reserve process. If you want it to be more conservative, the standard calculation with the longer warm is going to certainly be more conservative. If you want to do something that's got a shorter warm, the amortization there for you. So it's really, again, just trying to be responsive to a large number of banks who have different philosophies on how they approach the reserve calculation. Steve, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would say if to try to answer the question as best I can, what are we actually seeing as far as what choice a lot of our users are making and why? I would love to say that our users were looking at it and ignoring what it would result in from a reserve calculation and just saying, if I think about what the remaining life of these loans is actually going to be in the future, does it make more sense, hypothetically, theoretically, just, methodologically speaking, to take into account a standard amortization assumption or to not? In practice, the people that are using the warms with amortization are the ones that are trying to get their reserve down. And the ones that are using the warms without amortization, related, which results in a longer warm and a higher loss rate and a higher reserve level, all things being equal, they're the ones that have very low loss history and they're trying to justify how high the reserve is. So it's some reverse engineering going on. I think since you could argue either one is potentially appropriate, the answer is for you is which one serves your purposes for where you're trying to go or think you need to be with your reserve.
Yeah.
I think theoretically, just if I had to choose an approach that I think is the most appropriate and defensible, ignoring everything else, I think that since most loans in a bank's portfolio amortize on a relatively standard-ish basis with some obviously, again, that's a big assumption, that I would apply a universal assumption, amortization assumption, and bring that warm down to what I think is a more theoretically accurate number. And if I need to then get my reserve up higher because the warm is short, take into account a longer look back period, try to capture some stuff from the last credit cycle a little bit. And then there's going to be a little bit more burden on my Q factors, but I think appropriately so. But that's me personally.
Okay, so thank you for all the chats around this model validation. I mean, I think in some ways, if we changed ours from a SOC 1 and just called it a model validation, again, the auditors, we showed them the OCC handbook, right? We showed them what was necessary. They're the ones who came back to us and said this is what all we can do. So
I think the problem is
I don't want to belabor this point any further, but
there's a technical word validation and then there's a colloquial word validation, and we see it thrown around differently. Some people, when they say validation, they're using the term colloquially to mean maybe a SOC 1. Like there's lots of things validating can fall under that umbrella. And there's different technical ways the term validation has been defined in different accounting and regulatory, regulations in the past. So it's some apples and oranges going around as to what the expectations are.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think next year we'll just ask the auditors to call it a model validation, because I don't want to. I feel like we're just arguing about semantics, because it's not going to change the work that they do for the validation or SOC 1. So
right.
Okay. So Steve, I don't know where you want to go next on any of this. If you want to go back to this presentation.
Yeah, let's go back to the presentation. Why don't you go ahead and share that, and we'll go through the last few slides, because there's a couple more about what we saw happen to the reserves for the whole industry in the first quarter. And I think that's neat stuff that we can discuss a little bit more, because I think I certainly was curious to see what was going to happen. So before we get to that, there's a couple slides in here where we kind of were just reminding people how to handle how our tool creates a potential framework for unfunded commitments. Again, a lot of asides and footnotes to this, because we were creating a framework, I wouldn't say from scratch, but with limited detailed guidance from the regulators and the accountants, right? The language that was used in the CECL standard itself, and then some of the follow-ups that the interagency panels came out with, was kind of soft and wishy-washy when it came to unfunded commitments. And so we always knew that whatever we designed and created was A, going to be a starting point for an institution, and B, probably going to change over time as we got more feedback. And we weren't going to get good feedback about this until now, until this year, until people are actually having to go through audits and exams, living in a CECL ACL world. And so we expect to see some potential changes and enhancements, improvements, whatever you want to call them, to the unfunded commitment section of the tool as we get more details about what they're liking and what they would like to see being done different from a real world perspective. But the steps in running the unfunded commitments are, as I've sort of enumerated on the next slide here, right? The tool can pull your unfunded commitments, the gross balances from the call report. It would have been way too easy for the FDIC to have all the same segments of unfunded commitments as it has for the actual loan portfolio. That would have been shockingly rational. So that's not what happened. So we have some different buckets that we have to force the call report loan buckets into some unfunded commitments buckets. But it pulls those total balances in. Your first step is to determine what's unconditionally cancelable, right? And we've gotten more feedback about that now. There was some wrangling back and forth about things like HELOCs because as to make it even more confusing, there's more than one definition of unconditionally cancelable. There's a more regulatory based definition that the FDIC uses in their risk-based capital standards and everything else. That typically includes HELOCs as unconditionally cancelable. But then there's a different, more stricter definition that is preferred from FASB and most of the accounting side that is much more limiting on HELOCs. Not to say that a HELOC could never be unconditionally cancelable, but apparently the accountants are less likely to be comfortable with that, and the regulators are more likely to be comfortable with that. So where you fall on that is you're going to have to look at those contracts and see what the language is for canceling or freezing that available unused credit to see whether you're comfortable determining it as unconditionally cancelable. Things like credit card lines, always unconditionally cancelable. That's the only thing where I can say 100% of the time, unused credit card lines are the definition of unconditionally cancelable. Overdraft, very close to meeting that definition. So I would say pretty comfortable saying overdrafts, unused overdrafts are also unconditionally cancelable. But it's about looking at your contracts. And since we don't have a ton of public data on your unfunded commitments, we can only be so detailed in this part of a tool. Because we can't see inside them. We can only see what's on the call reports. Same thing with estimating the likelihood of funding. That's very much like prepayments is how I think about it, right? There's some industry data out there, not very much. They expect you to go and look at your own historical experience to try to guide you going forward for prepayments, just like with the likelihood of funding. The only guidance that we've ever found that's out there is guidance that the FDIC did their own study of credit conversion factors, what they call CCFs, and that's deep in the bowels of Schedule RCR Part 2, where they did some studies seeing how likely certain commitments were to be funded within a period of time moving forward. That's where our default values are sourced from, and there's a nice big long footnote at the bottom of that page which explains that in detail. But that's a starting point. The question is, do you have the time, energy, and is the juice worth the squeeze to go in and start, independently evaluating all your historical commitments and tracking them historically to see how much they've converted and at what rate? I don't know. I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze, and unless and until they look at your analysis and say you have to do that and you're not doing it, I wouldn't be doing it until then. Next step, calculating the weighted average remaining life of the commitment. So this is like a warm calculation, but it's much simpler and less data. And really a good starting point for that is 1 year. And the reason we put 1 year for this is because a lot of these contracts, we can't see your contracts, but a lot of them are written in such a way that they are annually renewable or at least reviewable. So the burden you have to meet here is, over what period of time are you legally obligated to extend credit? And if every year you can review or renew these, then it does not extend past that 1 year. So 1 year is a plug, but it intelligent, reasonable plug for most of you in most cases. Sean, let me know if you have, disagree with that or have additional thoughts on it.
No, I think that this is good. I think the point again, I think the overriding point was, again, most banks did not do anything for unfunded commitments. Secondly, as Steve is pointing out, right, this can be a rabbit hole, right? Let's not lose sight of the fact that these are loans that don't exist today. The requirement is to evaluate them to determine whether a reserve is necessary. Again, they are typically annually renewable. If they do become loans, they're going to get brought into your overall loan portfolio. So again, we just tried to provide a framework to kind of give our users something rather than a blank page.
This is a really upstream estimate we're talking about here, a theoretical upstream estimate that you're never going to have a loss on the unfunded commitment portfolio. I promise you. But it's a new requirement that we at least try to estimate if we need to reserve for these things before they become loans. And also, we also don't have the burden of 50 years worth of a specific ratio hammered into everyone's heads, right? Your examiners aren't coming with a pre-expected notion of this better end up around 1.25% or we're going to have a problem here, right? There is no framework for them having an expectation of what level it should be at that we've all been seeing for decades and talk about all the time. So I think there's less expectation that it has to meet a specific standard burden or hurdle to be, or otherwise you better defend the heck out of it. We just haven't seen any of that. And
there's really been no prescription to that point. I think this is again an area of evolution where we'll probably a year from now or 2 years from now, there might be that type of prescription. No guarantee that there will be, but I think this is an area where I think we'll just continue to monitor what the regulators and auditors suggest, but we just simply wanted to provide a way to think about them, right? Because these are in fact, for most banks, not terribly material, but the requirement is that we evaluate them. So we just simply tried to provide a framework to do it. If you've been doing something on your own, I would continue to do that. But for 90% of the banks, this is probably the first time we've ever had to do this. So we just tried to develop something to give you a way to think about them.
Yep. I think let's move on.
All right.
So Chris, I know we've already sort of we're on a time crunch here.
Yeah.
Do we want to go through these steps or do we want to talk about some of the industry data for the last couple of minutes?
Let's talk about the industry data. We can come back to that.
So this is not a page from our CECL tool. This is another page from our interactive tool, right? From the QwickAnalytics platform. So you all have access to this in addition to your CECL tool. This is just our ACL or allowance for credit loss page. And I took a couple snapshots from it and stuck it in here just so we can see what's really happening. How much are reserves actually increasing under CECL? And so if we look at the bottom, all the way to that last row on the bottom there, national median allowance balance as a percentage of total loans. And that's the last 6 quarters. So over the last 6 quarters, reserve to loans average for all banks in the United States was 1.16% at the end of last year and 1.19% under CECL in the first quarter of this year. So on an average basis for all 5,000 institutions in the country, increase, yes. Very much, no. Bigger the institution size, the bigger peer groups like UBPR peer group 1. Actually, go to the next slide for a second. This is looking at that same data, but in that industry research page that I was showing you guys a little while ago, I threw in UBPR peer group 5. That's the purple. Peer group 3. That's the red. The national of all banks in the country, and then UBPR peer group 1. So you'll notice the biggest jump, you see the blue line there in the third quarter, the bigger banks, the peer group 1 were at about 1.2%. And then they jumped up to over 1.3% in the fourth quarter because a lot of them were in the process of adopting early. And then in the first quarter up a little bit more. But for typical community banks, UBPR peer group 5, right? That's the big one for like a quarter of the community banks or half the community banks in the country are in UBPR 5. We saw like a 2 basis point increase in median loan loss reserve from your 1231 non-CECL to your 331 CECL. So increases across the board, yes, but not very material for the typical community bank on average across the country. So
Yeah.
interesting.
That's, yeah, very interesting. And so, again, I know we're up past an hour. Thank you all very much for the comments today, for the suggestions. Again, we will send out a copy of the slides today with a link to the recording. Certainly we'll continue to go through a lot of these issues that, and again, dive into some of them more specifically. We'll try to continue to make enhancements. We'll go back and talk to our auditors about, SOC 1 versus model validation. So, again, we're trying to do the best we can. Again, we probably can't please everybody, but it's not for a lack of trying. So, again, thank you all very much for your time today. We will be back next month. We do hopefully anticipate having a guest panelist. We do have a webinar Tuesday on the first quarter results. And so, Steve, any final comments before we let everybody get back to their day?
Nope. Appreciate again, someone who was talking and mentioned, forming user groups. It's something we talked about for a good while now, specifically with around CECL, but other areas as well. And this was kind of our first stab at that, right? Creating an environment where we could have more interaction with customers and users and sort of answer questions and have it in a way that they could take it and refer to it later, but a more open-ended kind of user to user forum for discussing these types of things is also something we're certainly open to and have kicked around some ideas for doing. So if anyone would like to be kind of part of a beta group or something in the future, please, shoot us an email and let us know that once we have something like that, you'd like to join and be part of it. And so we can continue to develop those types of tools and I guess service.
Yeah, and I know we didn't get to a couple of the questions in the chat, but I think there was a request about just for a one-on-one to go review your data. We're happy to do that. Just reach out to your salesperson. But again, we'll look through all the suggestions, comment on them. We'll get some polling questions based on the feedback we got today. Again, we'll talk with our auditors some more, but otherwise, thank you all very much for attending. Keep the comments coming. Thank you for participating, and we will see you next month.
Thanks, everybody.